Hello and welcome to Third Histories. This is the second episode in a multi-part series we're doing here on the Comanches. Episode 1 included some helpful background, sort of setting the scene for the episodes to follow. But if you just want to jump into the historical narrative, well, I hope you enjoy the show. In 1857, the U.S. military sent out one Captain Richard Ewell to Arizona to map this territory that the politicians on the East Coast knew so little about. And in one of his reports back from this astonishing landscape that Ewell has found, he makes some interesting references to some ruins that he stumbled across. Ewell said the following, quote, "A great part of my scout has been in a country without inhabitants, but with the ruins of what must have been large towns abandoned centuries ago. It would seem to be a semi-civilized people, migratory, and followed by another race at war, as the schools of herring are followed by the dolphin and the shark." End quote. What makes Ewell's observation interesting for our story here is that it seems like he's stumbled across basically some physical evidence of something we've already described. That is the Apaches pushing down south into the Pueblos, who themselves are being lorded over by their new neighbors to their south, the Spanish. And the Spanish have records themselves of Apaches and sort of the terror that they've imposed on the Pueblo peoples. But what the Spanish don't know yet, by the time we left off in our story at the Great Pueblo Revolt of 1680, what the Spanish don't know about yet is the Comanches. This population that is quietly, at least in the history books, pushing south themselves into the Apaches and thus pushing the Apaches into the Pueblos. In episode 1, we talked about how the Shoshone legends state that one of the reasons why the Comanches left their region in the Great Basin was to hunt for game and ponies. And after the Great Pueblo Revolt, those ponies have proliferated throughout the Great Plains. And the Comanches are looking for a grab. And in doing so, they show up for the first time in our history books. In the early 1700s, the Spanish begin to notice that a new population is seemingly driving off the Apaches. The Apaches, this tribe that, up until this point, the Spanish see as the big dogs on the block, the scariest native tribe that they've encountered. And all of a sudden, it seems like the Apaches themselves are the herring, as Ewell would have put it in his quote. Author of Empire of the Summer Moon, S.C. Gwynn, has a nice passage in his book that sort of gets at this path that the Comanches took from their pre-horse lifestyle up until becoming the dominant power in the geopolitical scene on the American plains. He says the following, quote, "What happened to the tribe between roughly 1625 and 1750 was one of the great social and military transformations in history. Few nations have ever progressed with such breathtaking speed from the status of skulking pariah to dominant power. The change was total and irrevocable, and it was accompanied by a complete reordering of the balance of power on the American plains. The tribes that had once driven the Comanche into the mountains of Wyoming would soon be either dim memories, like the Kansas, Omahas, or Missouris, or like the Apaches, Utes, and Osages, they'd be retreating to avoid extermination. The agent of this astonishing change was the horse, or, more precisely, what this backward tribe of Stone Age hunters did with the horse, an astonishing piece of transformative technology that had as much of an effect on the Great Plains as steam and electricity had on the rest of the world." End quote. And let's be clear, the Comanches were not alone in becoming skilled horsemen. The Sioux, Cheyenne, the Kiowa, probably mostly the Kiowa, the Comanches' sort of social cousins, the Arapaho, the Blackfoot, the Crow, all along with the Comanche become very skilled riders. But no one quite gets breeding and how to use the horse in combat and how to just care for the horse quite like the Comanche do. And it should be noted that, at least for a period of time, these tribes that initially master the horse are benefiting from the Europeans' arrival, right? These horses are being used immediately to transport material, and then quickly after that, they're being used in war. And it'll give these tribes a leg up. And most specifically, it'll give the Comanches a leg up in their generations-long war of extermination, as it's often described, against the Apaches. But before we get into what the Spanish were able to record about this war between the Apaches and then what the Spanish end up doing in response to the Comanches presenting a problem for them, let's just take a step back and think about sort of what it's like to have a horse society on the American plains. I think this is one of the most interesting and fascinating aspects about the Comanches, and maybe we could meditate on it just for a moment here before we launch back into the narrative. So I thought we could get through this somewhat methodically. Let's start with, how do you capture a horse? Well, the classic way, shared by Europeans on the plains and the natives as well, is you lasso the horse. But this presents a sort of interesting question. How exactly do you get close enough to a wild horse while you yourself are riding atop your horse? So basically, if it's a horse race and one of the horses is carrying a 150-pound Comanche warrior and the other one's not, well, how do you deal with that? How do you catch up with this riderless horse? One of the ways was to wait for a certain period of time in winter, right? When winter got really bad, horses simply get less food. They get worn down, especially a mare that has recently foaled. So Comanches would sort of put their best and fastest horses aside at some point in like the late fall, get their energy up, make sure they're well fed, and then take them out in search of mares that had recently given birth, the kind of weakest of the bunch that could be easily caught. And then conversely, in the summers, when horses are having to deal with this very hot, arid climate, one where water is hard to find, Comanches are going to spot some watering holes. Interestingly, though, they're not just going to wait for the horses to show up at the watering hole, grab them, and head off. They're going to wait for the horses to sort of gorge themselves on water. Apparently, this is pretty common. When horses are looking for water, as soon as they find it, they're going to sort of stock up, let's say. So you can imagine the Comanches sort of scouting out a stream or some body of water, waiting for the horse to guzzle down some water, and then being able to easily capture it because of how bloated and uncomfortable that horse is at that moment. Another method that the Comanches used, and also the Kiowa, was the corralling method. So this would happen in two ways. One was find a tree line on the plains, right, where the open plains sort of moves into a more wooded area. And between the trees, erect fences, put some obstacles in the way, and then sort of chase the horses into this corral that they've built, right? So that's one method. Another method was to, I call this one the young horse, old horse method. And I learned about this in a book called The Comanches, Lords of the Southern Plains by Ernest Wallace and E. Adamson Hobel. And if there's anybody out there who knows a lot about horses, especially wild horses, I'd be interested to know if this is real. But apparently, young, skittish horses can just be easily brought in by sending out an old mare. The Comanches would let loose an old mare, and the mare would go sidle up alongside the young horse, calm it down, and at that point, a Comanche warrior could go up to this horse and lead it back into camp along with the mare. I found that very interesting. Another method, even more interesting if we're being honest than the old horse, young horse method, was something called creasing, which I think I actually first learned about from an American source, specifically a Texan named Noah Smithwick. Now, creasing, heads up for the squeamish, but if you're squeamish, I'm not really sure if you're ready for what we're about to get into anyways. So, creasing is basically someone spots a horse on the plain, they have a rifle, and the goal is to shoot the horse just above the vertebrae, obviously without hitting the vertebrae. And I guess what would happen would be that the horse would then collapse unconscious, and then you'd hobble the horse, you'd tie its hooves together and its feet, and then you would basically break it once it woke up. And there's actually an early description of this from Noah Smithwick, where he basically is told by one of his friends, hey, let's go try this creasing method out, and it fails. They end up killing the horse. And I believe there's a reference here also of creasing in David Phillips's book, Wild Horse Country. And Phillips basically suggests that Europeans never were able to do this. So there's very few accounts of this actually working. Now, probably the most efficient and eventually the most common method of acquiring horses for the Comanche and also the Kiowa was to steal them. And I think if you're going to say that Comanches were the best horse riders, the best at firing their bow from atop a horse, they're also the best horse thieves, if we're just being honest. They were amazing at this. Now, the Kiowa actually take the cake for the record of the longest horse raid I've ever heard of. There's this idea floating around out there that the Kiowa actually went as far south as Guatemala to capture some horses. Now, the Kiowa are basically living in either northern Texas or somewhere in Oklahoma. So you got to imagine a tribe of, or not a tribe, but a group of men atop a horse without a map, traveling all the way from Oklahoma through Texas, through Mexico, north to south, and basically into Guatemala. And the reason why they think this happened was because the Kiowa seemed to know all about monkeys and parrots. And it wouldn't have been clear exactly how they would have found that out without actually getting into that territory where these other animals exist. I mean, the Comanches are so good at stealing horses that we have an account from one Colonel Dodge, who basically says that it was very common in an attempt to stop one's horse from getting stolen, it was very common to sort of tie a rope from your wrist to your horse, and they would sometimes wake up and the rope would be cut and their horse would be gone. And the main culprit that they thought was behind all of this was usually the Comanches. So that takes care of the question of how did the Comanches go about acquiring the horse. But, of course, that's not all. You still have to make the horse rideable. You have to break it. And again, here we're going to turn to S.C. Gwynn's Empire of the Summer Moon. This is going to be the place we go when I think we need a more lyrical description of what's going on, because Gwynn is a terrific writer. He describes the way the Comanches broke their horses as follows, quote, "A Comanche would lasso a wild horse, then tighten the noose, choking the horse and driving it to the ground. When it seemed as if the horse was nearly dead, the choking lariat was slacked. The horse finally rose, trembling and in a full lather. Its captor gently stroked its nose, ears, and forehead, and then put his mouth over the horse's nostrils and blew air into its nose. The Indian would then throw a thong around the now gentled horse's lower jaw, mount up, and ride away." End quote. So a CPR version of how to break a horse. But I think this is a sort of incredibly intimate moment, because as we will soon learn, the Comanche will spend his entire life, essentially, many of the greatest moments of his life, atop a horse. And to have such a moment with the animal that you will depend on greatly, it is a really intimate and fascinating moment to consider. So now we will move into the sort of bread and butter here. How did the Comanches become so talented atop a horse? And this brings up an interesting question. Of course, there was, at least at some point, the original Comanche horse rider. This is not a culture that has been exposed to these animals for very long, so you have to imagine that there was probably a big learning curve on how to actually ride the horse. If you've got no culture experience with this animal, how do you go about doing it? And this is sort of a mystery, at least for the first generation or two. Like I said, one can imagine a lot of trial and error. Some cultural diffusion from the Pueblos probably allowed somewhat of an easy transition, as they've been around horses for over 100 years by the time the Comanches really start to acquire them. And Wallace and Hope will provide a lot of detail on how exactly young Comanche boys and girls, to some degree, were conditioned to make the horse a part of their not just everyday existence, but a moment-to-moment partner throughout life. And like I said, this will be a lengthy quote, but I think it will give us a good idea of just how important this animal was. Quote, "One of the first things a Comanche child learned was to ride. He started riding in a pack on his mother's back long before he could walk. Next, he was strapped to her saddle on a gentle mare. By the time he was 4 or 5, he was off on his own pony. Both boys and girls were taught to ride with or without the saddle. Girls were taught to ride astride and became almost as much at home on horseback as the boys. But it was not enough for the Comanche boy merely to learn to ride. He had to be a trick rider. Day in and day out, month after month, he practiced in drill. He learned to pick up objects off the ground while his mount was traveling at full speed. At first, small and light objects were selected. But as the boy grew older and more proficient, heavier and more bulky objects were exchanged for the lighter ones, until at last, unassisted and at full speed, he might be able to pick up from the ground and swing across his horse the body of the heaviest man. To rescue a fallen comrade was the highest obligation of any Comanche warrior. To leave a comrade on the field to be scalped and mutilated by desecrating enemies was a disgrace to the people. Every man was expected to be able to meet the challenge when the need arose, and he had to be able to do it alone. Generally, however, rescues were made by 2 men working together, rushing neck by neck on either side of the prostrate person. Both riders stopped at the same instant and swung the body in front of the riders." End quote. And that Colonel Dodge that we quoted just a little while back on Comanche horse thieving, he has a nice description of what he witnessed, and this comes from his book, The Plains of the Great West. Quote, "I am ready, without hesitation, to pronounce the Comanches the most extraordinary horsemen I have seen in yet all my travels. Amongst their feats of riding there is one that has astonished me more than anything of the kind I have ever seen or expect to see in all my life. A stratagem of war, learned and practiced by every Comanche young man, by which he is able to drop his body on the side of his horse at the instant he is passing, effectively screened from his enemy's weapons, as he lays in a horizontal position behind the body of his horse, with his heel hanging over the horse's back. In this wonderful condition he will hang whilst his horse is at full speed, carrying with him his bow and shield, and also his long lance, 14 feet in length." End quote. And from this position, we are told that the Comanches could fire 2 arrows in the time that it took to fire and reload a musket. So, this high-speed chase, this ability to fire quickly, and while using the horse's body as a shield, this is something that comes up in a lot of the written accounts of those who saw the Comanches in action atop a horse. And this specifically fascinated and was something that was so impressive that almost no one could believe it when they first saw. Unsurprisingly, the horse also played a big role in the Comanches' picture of the afterlife. Death is such a universal event for people that it's always surprising to see something different than you'd see somewhere else. But the Comanches met death of the members of their societies with extreme emotion. As we'll see later on, women especially have a practice of, once they've learned that their husband or their brother or their father has fallen in battle, they mutilate themselves, sometimes cutting fingers off or worse. After this maybe ritualistic sort of mutilation, they were not to discuss the fallen hero in war again. Now, early on, the Comanches appear to have actually destroyed the horses of a killed warrior, right? So if a warrior dies in battle, his horses will soon be killed and buried too. And it's even believed that further back in Comanche history, they did something similar with Comanche wives. Both of these practices will eventually be scrapped. At least in the horse's case, it's probably because the horse is just so valuable that they can't afford to get rid of any of these animals, right? So killing the deceased horse was eventually traded for cutting off a part of its tail, something more ritualistic. And as we mentioned, the women might have even come into this self-mutilation practice in a similar way. Instead of the wife of a Comanche warrior being killed once he dies, perhaps women adopted the self-mutilation ritual maybe to sort of supplant the killing of the wife instead. All right. So I think now we have done enough to lay the groundwork to start getting into a real narrative of Comanche history. The first mention of Comanches in any book anywhere that's written that we know of is either in 1705 or 1706, and I tend to see the 1706 number more frequently. The story that you hear most often with the 1706 number is that the Comanches arrive or meet some Spaniards, probably somewhere in New Mexico or Texas, and they've come along with Utes, a tribe that the Spanish are already themselves familiar with. And they've showed up with Utes, and remember how the Comanches got their name in the first place. The Utes actually are the ones who, at least for Spanish and English speakers, name the Comanches. For the Utes, Comanche means those who fight us, or something like that. Another translation goes something like those who fight us all the time and won't stop. There are many sort of variations there. Because historically, the reason why they had those names for the Comanches was because that's how they knew them. But by the early 1700s, the Comanches and the Utes have forged an alliance. And this will last for some time. Ultimately, it will come to an end, and we will touch on that at some point in our story. But now, however, they're partners in raiding and trading in New Mexico at the very least. It's most likely that the Comanches who arrive first in the Spanish history books are from the Yampirca or Yamparica a band. That's the band that is operating in southern New Mexico. The reason for the alliance between the Utes and the Comanches likely has to do with a trade-off. The alliance is built based on the Utes needing assistance in their constant battles with the Navajos to their west. The Navajos are an incredibly populous tribe when compared to the Utes and the Comanches. So the Utes need some extra men to help bolster their effort there. To their south, the Utes are also having problems. This would be either with people who are themselves Pueblo or who are pretty close. These would include the Tewa, Tano, Jemez, Picuris, and the Keres. I'm sure I've butchered at least a few of those pronunciations. So that explains why the Utes want to engage in this alliance with the Comanches. Now, what do the Comanches get? Well, they got land, and primarily the reason we think that they needed this land was to graze their horses. They simply were starting to build up this stockpile of Arabian barb Mustangs, and they needed somewhere to let them roam and feed. Along with this, they also got intelligence from the Utes. The Utes have more contact to the south. They'll be in touch with what's going on with the Spanish Empire's advance north, and the Comanches are concerned about this. We'll see this time and time again. The Comanches, and really all Plains tribes, are experts in intelligence. Much later in our story, when we get into what the U.S. military and the Rangers are up to, we're going to notice that it's almost impossible to have a successful campaign against any tribe on the Plains without help from another member of some tribe on the Plains also. Right? The only ones who can really navigate this territory for a very long time are going to be the Amerinds who live there. So this means that you're going to constantly see, at least from the European settler side, them running into all sorts of peoples they weren't prepared for when out on campaign. And the Comanches want to avoid this themselves. And the Utes are going to help them do that by supplying some information about these new people to their south. Now, while the Spanish will encounter the Comanches first in 1705 or 1706, they won't really see much of them in the decades that follow. However, the Spanish do begin to notice something odd going on around them. They notice that the Apaches are sort of dwindling, and then all at once they're gone. Their raids are slowing down, and they're basically disappearing. And this bugs the Spanish, or at least piques their interest so much that they start sending out some soldiers to kind of figure out, well, what's happened to our kind of long-standing enemies here? And what these soldiers find are basically abandoned Apache camps just north of that current U.S.-Mexican border. And Gwynn notes this in his work, too. He says the following, quote, "Starting around 1706, the Spanish authorities in Santa Fe began to notice a striking change in the behavior of their hated enemies, the Apache. They were, it seemed, disappearing, or at least moving off, generally to the south and west. The Spanish civil and military establishments began to realize that some sort of catastrophe had befallen the Apaches, though the extent of it would not be clear for years to come." End quote. Brian DeLay, author of a very detailed book on Comanche raids into Mexico in the 19th century, reports that the Spanish actually have some records that the Apaches came and told them, or at least someone in the Spanish government, that, hey, there are these new people called the Comanches, and they are driving us off of our land. So some information like that appears to have reached the Spanish. But whether or not the Spanish knew what was happening to the Apaches, it must have been spooky, right? At this point, the Spanish have been dealing with Apaches for almost a century. And the Apache have been basically impervious to any attempt the Spanish have made to get them off their land and stop raiding the Pueblo. And all of a sudden, they've disappeared. That it must be a little bit spooky, right? There are some stories in history where, mostly ancient history, where a population from a powerful tribe or entity, right, comes across the ruins of a civilization that's greater than the one they themselves came from. And it brings to mind the idea that something greater than yourself can be wiped out. Now, the Spanish might not actually have this kind of thought process going on themselves, right? Mexico at this point is still New Spain. Spain is still, at this point, pretty wealthy and doing well in the European geopolitical scene. So there's no real way that the Apaches are ever going to challenge Spain's eminence in the larger picture. But if you're on the ground in this northern New Spain, southern United States wilderness at this point, it must be spooky. The people who have been terrifying you and the people around you the most all of a sudden say that they have an enemy themselves to their north who terrifies them. So as I said, after the first mention of the Comanches in the history books, you won't see too much of them for a while. But when they do return to our history books, they're trading in New Mexico at what the histories call these kind of trading fairs. They were sort of, maybe a week long or sometimes shorter events where all sorts of peoples, the Spanish included, could come and trade goods. So, and it was sort of sanctioned by the Spanish government wherever it had influence, and there were some rules set up, but more or less this was supposed to be a peaceful place. And the Comanches would, in some ways, change that. So let's just admit it up front. The Comanches, like all people, are economically interested. And after they're done pushing the Apache south off the Great Plains, this region that is heavily inhabited with buffalo, they're going to fill an economic niche that was left by the Apache. What I mean by that is the Comanches will begin arriving at these trading fairs, many in the Taos or the Taos region of New Mexico, and they'll be bringing in the goods that are associated with the buffalo. One of those will be buffalo skins, tanned hides, dried meats, but one of their primary trading items is going to be other people, mostly, if not almost exclusively, other Native Americans. Now, the Comanches viewed and treated captives somewhat differently than we might expect today. But one result of this is that they'll find a new value in taking captives. Formerly, a Comanche might take a captive during a raid, enslave them, and basically treat them more or less like a chattel slave. However, there were more opportunities for Amerind captives to elevate themselves in Comanche society than we would typically expect of, let's say, the slavery that was practiced by the Europeans moving into the New World. So if you've been taken as a slave by the Comanches, well, one, that means you've avoided being killed on a raid, so that means you're not an adult man. You're probably not a small child or a baby, but if you're a child that can walk and maybe ride a horse and you're not going to be too much of a hassle, you're probably going to end up as a slave of the Comanches. Now, you might be given sort of menial tasks to do. You might participate in the treatment and tanning of hides that'll then be sold at these fairs. However, once the Comanches make contact with the Spanish, slaves begin to take on an entirely new value. Now, technically, the Spanish have outlawed slavery. However, they do have this program of buying back enslaved peoples and then basically trying to Christianize them in the best case scenario, and then in the worst case scenario, shoving them into one of their silver mines, where the survival rate was quite low. Because the Spanish are buying back these captives, well, all they've really done is incentivize Comanches and Utes to just take more and more slaves. And many of these slaves would come from the Navajo and Apache tribes that they've been terrorizing, right? The Utes mostly terrorizing the Navajos, or at least just going to war with the Navajos, and the Comanches focusing more on the Apaches. In order to fully exploit the the sort of price that the Spanish are going to be paying at the market. Remember, most of these deals are either going to involve or be directly done with Spanish priests who might have, let's say, more heartstrings to tug on than the average sort of weathered and experienced Spaniard that might be operating up in this New Mexico territory. So, and this is going to be difficult to talk about, but many of the first early examples of the Comanches making an impression on people in the New Spain, New Mexico territory is going to involve these slave auctions or these slave deals where the Comanches are going to be selling the Spanish slaves that have been taken from the Apaches and the Navajos, and they're going to be selling them back to the Spanish for them to basically Christianize them. And one of the ways that the Comanches are going to try to drive up the price is creating an impression of what slavery is like under the Comanches that is totally intolerable to these Spanish priests. And I have a rather graphic example here that I'll try to sort of ease into from a Franciscan that was operating in New Mexico named Fray Andres Varro. Now, he reported that the Comanches were publicly, let's say, violating their captive women in the marketplace, where they were to be sold, and basically doing this in a way that would get a lot of attention and would kind of let everyone know that, look, if you don't buy this female slave from us, look what this person is going to have to go through once we leave this market. Is this simply the act of a rapist? Probably not. And this is something that author Pekka Hamilanian, I'm sure I'm butchering that name. Now, he has probably produced what I think is the definitive book if you really want to understand what the Comanches were up to from an early point all the way up until the late 19th century. The book is Pekka Hamilanian's The Comanche Empire. And he deals with this very upfront and in a candid way. And he's basically saying, look, the Comanches are not just brutal savages here. They're trying to drive up the price. And they know that one of the considerations for these Franciscans and these priests, they just feel bad for the slaves that are being brought to market. And the Comanches assume, and they're probably right in believing, that a better price will be had for one of these captives if they sort of exploit the sensibilities of Europeans. And Hamilanian also points out that this might have served a dual purpose. It might have indicated to the Spanish that, well, you should really play ball on our terms in general, not just in the slave market, because this might cause us, you not playing by our terms, it might cause us to raid your settlements too. We've already shown what we can do against the Apaches. Our Ute friends have showed what they can do against the Navajo. And we'll take your women just as we take their women, and look what'll happen if we decide to do that. So these public rapes will become sort of a part of the fare that really enrages these Spanish priests. And I'd like to quote quickly from Hamilanian here to sort of get at what he's talking about. Quote, "The serial rapes were a graphic forewarning of the horrors captive women would, at least supposedly, endure in the Comanche hands, should the Spaniards refuse to ransom them. Brutality, in other words, helped legitimize the slave market in Spanish eyes." End quote. Hamilanian also states in the intro to his book that, quote, "The Comanches created the largest slave economy in the colonial Southwest." End quote. And Hamilanian goes on to say that taking slaves likely had a lot to do with the story of the Comanches not just getting onto the plains, but staying there and making it their home. And we started at the beginning talking about how the Shoshones were telling ethnographers that the Comanches left in pursuit of the horses, but it could be something like, well, they left for the horses, liked the land due to the buffalo, and realized they could become rich in this area by taking slaves. So the slavery aspect of the Comanches' sort of migration south and their entering the history books has a lot to do with this human trafficking. And I have a lengthy quote from Hamilanian who gets at this point directly. He says the following, quote, "It might be tempting to imagine that the Comanche exodus onto the southern plains was inspired by the endless horizons and unlimited opportunities opening to the east. But it is more likely that the migration, which also pulled several Ute bands away from their mountain homelands, began as extended slave raids. As the attacks of Comanche and Ute slavers intensified around the turn of the century, the Jacarillas, that's an Apache tribe, and the Carlanas, another Apache tribe, sought refuge deeper on the plains and abandoned their old campgrounds at the headwaters of the Arkansas and along the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Rather than bringing relief from raids, however, the retreat drew Comanche and Ute slavers into the very heart of Apacheria. Tracking the fleeing Jicarillas and Carlanas onto the plains, Comanches and Utes turned the upper Arkansas Basin into a war zone. By 1740, the human traffic had become so extensive that the former Indian captives, the people that the Spanish are buying back from the Comanches, let's remember, were granted permission to form their own community on the border because the Spanish could not absorb all the captives into their households as laborers. End quote. Author Thomas Cavanaugh in his book talks about how, we just had Hamelanian talking about how the Apaches are retreating from the Comanches are following them into what was Apacheria and is now quickly becoming Comancheria. And, Cavanaugh talks about the fact that even once the Apaches are basically living side by side with the Pueblos peoples in basically smaller towns, the Comanches will begin raiding those towns also. So there's really, it seems like, no escape for the Apaches from their, the ferocious Comanche raids coming out of the north. And Cavanaugh also includes an account from a Spanish explorer from the 1720s who was sent deep out into Texas to see what was causing these Apaches to flee south, right? So in the 1720s, basically all the Spanish know about the Comanches is that, there's this population of maybe 1,500 or so different Native Americans than the ones that we've been usually dealing with, and all these other Native Americans that we've known about are terrified of these people. So they've sent this explorer out to basically figure out what's going on with these terrible Comanches. And from this explorer, we learned the following, quote, "Each year at this time, there comes to this province a nation of Indians very barbarous and warlike. Their name is Comanche. Their origin is unknown, because they are always wandering in battle formation, for they make war on all the nations. They halt at whichever stopping place and set up their campaign tents, which are buffalo hide, and carried by large dogs which they raise for this purpose. The clothing of the men does not pass the navel, and that of the women passes the knee. And after they've finished the commerce which brought them there, which consists of tanned skins, buffalo hides, and those young Indians which they capture, because they kill the older ones, they retire, continuing their wanderings until another time." End quote. But in the early 1700s, when the Comanches are really first coming on the scene as these prolific slave raiders and slave sellers, they will begin to run into a problem that is a product of the sort of natural Comanche decentralization. If you're interested in this subject, you probably already know that Native American tribes and societies are not quite set up like ours today, at least in the Western world, let's say. They're highly decentralized. They usually involve a sort of kind of war leader who's making a lot of the important decisions, and that leader can change very quickly. And that sort of authority figure can shift. So it's very hard to make deals, at least from the Spanish point of view, with the Comanches in total. You might be able to make a deal with one band or one leader who has a group of loyal followers, but even that leader could fall out of favor with his followers quickly, and the deal could just be off as soon as that happens. So while these slave raids will bring more goods, more horses, some carbohydrates, which the Comanches are trading for their protein stock in buffalo, and clothing, along with guns, which hopefully we'll be able to have time to get into shortly, the Comanches will have to strike a delicate balance, because while some bands will be, selling goods in one of these smaller villages outside Taos, a different Comanche band could come in just as quickly and raid them. So a lot of the times you might sort of see the goods that the Comanches are selling to the Spaniards or other Native Americans in these fairs. A different Comanche band could come around 2 weeks later and steal all of it back. And if you're the Spanish, it's all the same to you. It's all the same group of people. And you, from your point of view, how would you feel if you were dealing with a member of a group and they sold you something, and then a different member of the same group comes and steals it from you the week later? You're going to be pretty upset, and you're going to try and hold basically the entire group accountable. And that's predictably what the Spanish end up doing. So as we creep closer and closer to the 1740s, a time where the Spanish and the Comanches will face off in direct hostilities, we begin to see the Spanish outlawing Comanches from these trading markets and these fairs that were being held in the Taos region. Now, if we recall in an earlier episode, we talked about how once the Apaches were banned from trading with the Pueblos peoples, the Apaches turned to something they do quite well, raiding. Now, in that case, we're going to assume, and it seems more than likely, that the Apaches were trading protein, that is buffalo meat, for Pueblo corn. And we even saw some interesting moments where, as an explanation for, well, why are the Apaches killing the livestock when they, raid these Puebloan settlements? Well, that's because they want to emphasize to the Pueblos exactly what they're losing by dipping out on the former trading networks that were arranged between the Pueblos and the Apaches. The Comanches are going to do something quite similar. Once the Spanish ban them from their trading markets for obscene behavior with their slaves that they're trying to sell, and also the general Spanish distaste with slavery as an overt institution, the Spanish were more than happy to use something like forced labor, but they weren't into the abject slavery thing. The Comanches are going to do exactly what the Apaches did. They're just going to begin taking what they need rather than trading for it. Another explanation that probably provides some context to the difficulties the Spanish had with the Comanche way of trading and the way that they conducted business has to do with some cultural differences that the Comanches had with the Spaniards. And Hamilanian, who spends a lot of time outlining the trade networks that the natives and the Europeans were engaged in, he has a nice quote that gets at this sort of cultural conflict that was taking place. He says the following, quote, "Spaniards believed that bargaining and fluid exchange rates were an essential part of trade, for they helped determine the balance between supply and demand, whereas Comanches saw trade as a form of sharing between kinspeople, who took care of each other's needs and therefore did not haggle. If the Spaniards bargained for better prices, they acted as strangers, placing themselves outside the circle of kinship where sharing and exchange took place." End quote. By the early 1740s, these differences culminate in an all-out Comanche raiding attack on New Mexico and these Spanish settlements. And this basically continues until the mid-1740s. And there's some evidence that some Tauseños, this is the Native Americans living in the Taos region, were acting as informants. An early example of something we'll see time and time again that I referenced earlier. The Comanches are going to be as good as anybody else at gathering intelligence on, what's going on to their south and on their borders generally. In 1746, we have a record of the Pecos Pueblo peoples repulsing an attack made by the Comanches. And the Spanish, along with many native allies, will then pursue this band out onto the plains and apparently defeat them pretty thoroughly. The next year, the Spanish have decided they've had enough, and in 1747, they send out a punitive expedition of 500 soldiers accompanied by many Native American scouts and warriors. They deliver what is probably the worst defeat the Comanches have faced up until this point by Europeans, but maybe by anybody, if we're being honest. The Comanches are such a small band that these numbers, you really have to inflate them to feel what that damage must have felt like to the Comanches themselves. The Spanish find a large camp of Comanches and Utes. They kill 107. They capture 206 Comanches and Utes that are likely then sold into the quasi-slavery that the Spanish are practicing. And then they carry off 1,000 horses. So early on, we have an idea of, it looks to me, if we have 206 captives, 107 killed, that's like 3 horses a person. So the Comanches' horse stock is probably already outnumbering their human stock at this point. As we've mentioned, the Comanches are never in a position to really lose too many people in any given conflict. And especially at this time where they're still having these constant border wars to their north with other tribes. We've already mentioned that the Pawnees to the Comanche north have been giving them issues, and it seems like the Pawnees, along with everyone else in this region, is starting to realize that these horses are super valuable. The Comanches have the most horses of anybody that they're going to come into contact with. So the Comanches are sort of luring enemies in with their large stock of horses. But along with these attacks on the north, we begin to see more and more pressure to the Comanches east. And that is directly due to other Europeans that have landed in North America other than the Spanish. Now, the French are probably responsible for the Osages, this new enemy that the Comanche are going to be facing to their east. The French are probably responsible for giving them some French muskets. We will begin to see shortly the French play a pivotal role in the politics of the Great Plains. And the Spanish are going to take note of this, and hopefully we'll have time to get into that shortly. The Spanish are going to start to kind of freak out about the influence that the French seem to have to their north in this territory that the Spanish are still claiming belongs to them. Hamilanian describes this moment in Comanche history, the mid-1740s to late 1740s, as, quote, the most critical hour on the southern plains, because we see that, the sort of European walls to the south, to the east are sort of closing in. And a larger story at play here that I'd love to get into, but it just seems too complex to deal with fully here, is this idea that the Spanish are pushing from the south. The other Europeans that are landing on the east coast of the United States are pushing east. The French, sort of in the southeast, are pushing upwards too, though albeit in a different way than the Anglos and the Spanish. But it's not just Europeans. The more and more that Europeans push into the interior of the continent, the more and more that they're going to drive other Native Americans into the middle of the continent also. So the early effects of the Europeans in the east on Comanches is not going to be the Comanches seeing Europeans for themselves. It's going to be seeing the tribes that had originally existed much closer to the eastern sort of coast. These tribes are going to start to appear in Comanche territory. So ironically, as the Comanches are grabbing more and more territory on the southern plains, they're beginning to encounter this sort of smashing in of tribes into the middle of the continent. And Hamilanian touches on this in a nice passage I'd like to quote. He says the following, quote, "Their half-century expansion had drawn them into disastrous multi-front wars that engulfed them on three sides. But the mid-1740s also saw the Comanches reconfiguring their overall foreign political strategy in a way that allowed them to maneuver out of military crises. Their half-century expansion had drawn them into disastrous multi-front wars that engulfed them on three sides. But the mid-1740s saw the Comanches refigure their overall foreign political strategy in a way that allowed them to maneuver out of the military crisis. Eschewing war for diplomacy and treaty-making, they fashioned in rapid order an elaborate alliance network that not only stabilized their northern and eastern borders, but also gave them access to weaponry with which they were able to turn to their military fortunes in the West." End quote. This process of creating this Comanche alliance network begins by making peace and allying with this group that is called, in Hamilanian's work, the Tauvayas. Really, this is the strongest band of what is generally called the Wichitas. And if we're going to be referring to either Wichitas or Tauvayas, we're probably using those terms interchangeably here. A year or two later, the Wichitas will then help broker a peace deal between the Comanches and the Pawnees to their north. So all of a sudden, the Comanches are beginning to clean up some of the issues that they have along their borders, just as the Spanish are really turning their sights on them. The French likely played some role in getting the Wichitas to broker this deal. The French, we're told, have a good relationship with the Wichitas. And so the Spanish are going to also learn this. As we note, the Spanish are going to start to freak out about this influence that the French are having on this region that the Spanish can't really make sense of, and they've been there for over 100 years. Now, you might wonder, well, what is the French interest in all of this? Now, the French, without getting too deep into the weeds here, French gun traders understand that it's not economically feasible for them to reach out from their holdings in the southeast into modern-day Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, and I'm sure if they could get as far as New Mexico, the French traders would. But what they can do is help broker alliances between native tribes that can then create a sort of stream of commerce, that can then create a sort of network of commerce where it then becomes more profitable for all tribes to sort of engage in the French goods trade. So you can imagine that a tribe that formerly would max out at buying, let's say, 10 guns every spring would all of a sudden want to buy 50 or maybe even more because they know that they can use a certain amount of guns themselves, and then they can pass them along and trade them up this network of alliances that is being created between the Wichita, the Pawnees, the Comanches. And all of this, the effect is really, all of a sudden the French are arming a bunch of very hostile tribes to the Spanish's north with weapons that they're going to use in concert, because not only these tribes are not fighting amongst each other, they're also supplied with technology that is putting them closer to being on par with the Spanish. It seems like the Comanches are mostly trading horses, robes, and Apache slaves to the Wichitas, likely for French guns, corn, and then also beans. So again, we see the Comanches trading protein and humans for what they have a hard time finding themselves, like carbohydrates and these French guns. And the turnaround here for the Comanches is pretty swift. After they've finished cleaning up their borders and forming these alliances, they begin to turn more and more of their attention to the South and the Spanish. After a number of devastating raids in New Mexico, we're told that the Spanish sort of call off their war against the Comanches. It might be uncertain why exactly we're calling this a war, but what's really happening are some smaller punitive expeditions and just general hostilities, the calling off of trade that the Spanish have introduced to this relationship they have with the Comanches. So the Spanish will sort of break all of this off. Not that they're going back into a thorough trading partnership with the Comanches, but they are calling off their punitive expeditions, at least for now. And maybe we should back up quickly and just hone in on what's going on in the Spanish plan here. So, for the Spanish, this new Comanche alliance with the Wichita, the Pawnees, and therefore the French is startling, as we've noted. The Spanish still have this pipe dream of colonizing Texas, colonizing New Mexico, and reaching even further north, but they realize that the French are better positioned to do that given their alliance with the Comanches. The Spanish initially try placating the Comanches with more gifts than what they believe that the French are giving them. So after this 1748 moment where the Spanish sort of clean the slate, they actually begin, like I said, trying to placate the Comanches into calling off their relationship with the French. But if you're a Comanche, the best deal for you is to just keep getting what you're getting from the French and, let the Spanish give you as much as they want until they realize what they're doing is futile. That's basically what it seems like the Comanches will do. But quickly after cleaning the slate and trying to placate the Comanches with gifts, the Comanches are going to turn around and raid one of the Pecos settlements again. The Spanish will throw their hands up. They'll send out a force of soldiers, and they'll follow the Comanches onto the Llano Estacado, which, you should go Google a picture of this landscape. It is positively hellish. But the Spanish actually do quite well here on this expedition. We're told that they kill 112 Comanches in battle. And apparently this is a result of the Spanish getting a really favorable battleground to fight on. Apparently it was close quarters in some sort of canyon maybe. On the open plains, it would be hard to imagine the Spanish being able to take down this many Comanches. But again, another devastating blow for the Comanches takes place here. As a result, the Comanches are going to agree to a peace deal with the Spaniards. This seems to be the first peace deal that the Comanches ever strike up with a European power. This occurs in 1752. Importantly, this will mean that the Comanches will supposedly call off their New Mexico raids. However, this doesn't mean that the Spanish have any right to enter Comancheria, primarily in Texas, probably leaking out into New Mexico as well. But as we'll see, through some brilliant Apache deception, the Spanish will find themselves lured into Comancheria, almost into the heart of Comancheria. So we've mostly been talking about New Mexico because this is where Taos is and the fairs and markets associated with the Spanish. They're mostly in New Mexico. However, Texas is also a territory the Spanish are certainly interested in. San Antonio's developed pretty early on, but the Spanish always have trouble sort of maintaining a foothold there. Not only because of the Comanches, but also because there are many Apaches in the area a little bit closer to the border. These are mostly Lipan Apaches. And those Apaches are themselves caught in a multi-front war, similar to what the Comanches had recently faced in the 1740s. The Apaches have the Comanches to their north, an ever-present danger for them over probably 2 generations at this point, and the Spanish to their south, similarly, that have been a problem for generations. So the Apaches are finding themselves ever more in a very difficult situation to get themselves out of, and at least the Lipans seem to come up with a plan that we're about to get into. In 1794, this is 3 years before that Comanche-Spaniard peace deal, in 1794 something strange happens. A band of Lipan Apaches meet with some Spanish officials in San Antonio, and they not only request a peace deal, they say that they want a mission in their territory. They want Spanish priests to come up into Texas, set up some religious sites, and begin preaching the gospel and Christianity to the Lipan Apaches. From the Spanish point of view, at least the priest's point of view, this is like a dream come true. This is why you've come to the New World. Now, it seems like some Spanish officials outside the priesthood, likely mostly military men, are not so happy with this possibility. They're suspicious. But the Apaches are saying that they want this mission set up somewhere along or near the San Saba River, and it's rumored that there are some hills that are packed with gold and maybe silver as well up in this region. So this looks tempting from their angle as well, all religious interests aside. But there's a big problem with this San Saba region and territory. It is not Apacheria. The Apaches have no claim on this land any longer. This is thoroughly Comanche territory. It's actually right in the heart of their territory, at least of the Penateca Band. And this Penateca Band we're going to return to. They sort of plagued Texas in the early 1800s. The Penatecas are, at least among the Comanches, not as socialized to European contact as the Yampircas might be, who have some more experience dealing with the Spanish. The Penatecas are not going to be these Comanches that show up at the fairs in New Mexico. They're going to be, let's say, even more hostile than the Comanches that the Spanish have been dealing with up until this point. Now, eventually the Spanish get the Crown's approval back in Europe to go set up this mission. And with an escort of 100 soldiers, they head up there with 4 or 5 priests. Now, maybe pull out a map of Texas and check out where San Saba is today. This is right in the middle of Texas. This is some dangerous territory, and this time just because of the possibilities of being stranded there and losing your horses, right? It's not just that you might get hit with some arrows or French musket fire. If someone decides to steal your horses in this territory, you could very likely starve or die of thirst. Now, these priests and the 100 soldiers are going to be led by a man named Don Diego Ortiz de Parilla. Parilla, of everyone that's associated with this story, probably trusts the Apaches the least. So an interesting guy to have as your leader here, somebody who is very skeptical about this plan working at all, but he ends up being the one who kind of leads this expedition north into the center of Texas. Now, as I said, this mission was requested back in 1749. However, the Spanish won't arrive until 1757. This is 5 years after that brokered peace deal between the Comanches and the Spanish. So a lot of time has passed between when the Lipans first arrive and start beginning to request this mission. We're told that in the interim, Lipans will arrive in San Antonio every once in a while, and they'll basically ask for some gifts. And along with that, they'll kind of suggest that we're still interested in this mission. So this has been a kind of slow-moving development, but eventually the Spanish make their way up into the heart of Texas. And they arrive in April, and in June they notice an encampment of 3,000, we're told Indians, at least in the sources I have. It's unclear to me exactly who these Native Americans might be, but they're definitely not interested in Christianity. It seems like they're moving on some very large buffalo hunt. So at least this first sort of potential good sign doesn't actually prove to be much. Pretty soon there is some dissension in the ranks. A few priests begin considering that the cause there is lost. They begin lobbying the government to call them back to New Spain. S.C. Gwynn, he described the situation that the Spanish were facing and that they'd gotten themselves into like this, quote, "The San Saba mission proposal was indeed a sham. The Lipans and other bands never had any intention of converting to Christianity. But what neither Padilla nor any Spanish official had understood was the reason for the deception, and thus they had no idea of the extent of the treachery that had been perpetrated upon them. What had in fact happened, while the Padres were busy shining their sacramental vessels, was the Comanche Empire, an area far larger than any Spaniard suspected in those years, had arrived precisely on their doorstep. The Spanish had been cleverly lured well beyond the actual boundaries of Apache land. The San Saba country was not their homeland at all. It was Comancheria proper, and a Spanish fort there amounted to a declaration of war on the Comanches. This was exactly what the Apaches wanted. They wanted their dire enemy destroyed, or at least stopped in its relentless southward sweep." End quote. The Spaniards decide to wait out the winter in San Saba. In March, on the morning after a full moon, the priests awake to find that some natives who were camped out near the Spanish mission had vanished. Soon after, they find that 62 of their horses had been stolen. In response, Padilla sends out 15 Spanish riders to track down the thieves, but they'd soon return, reporting that nearby there were hills lined with hostile Indians. Now, maybe at this point, it should be important to note that the soldiers that the Spanish have brought up there are actually not staying with the priests. The mission that the priests are operating in is about a couple miles away from where all the soldiers are located, and that's going to be important for this story that's about to unfold. So once Padilla learns that there are hostile natives in the area, he sets off to go try to persuade the priests to come back to the fort with him to remain safe. The soldiers there are going to be well equipped. We can assume that because there are way more of them staying at the fort, that they have more provisions should they need to wait out some kind of siege. However, the Padres decide to stay back. They're still trusting the natives in the territory, and they decide to remain at the mission. Padilla decides to keep behind 17 soldiers with them to keep them safe should any hostile natives decide to attack the mission. Now, I found a bit of a discrepancy between some of the sources on the timing of this event, but according to Fehrenbach, on the next day, March 16th, the Comanches, who have lined these hills, make their move. While the Padres are performing mass, they begin to hear yells and war cries from outside the mission walls. And when they go to take a better look, they find themselves surrounded by 2,000 Comanches and Wichitas, their faces painted black and red, the colors of the Plains Indians on the field ready to go to war. They're holding bows, lances, and muskets. And according to Fehrenbach, they're wearing headdresses of feathers, deer antlers, and bison horns. Now, initially, the Comanches will sort of feign a desire to maybe exchange some gifts, and maybe the Comanches will be on their way. But quickly to the priests, it becomes clear that that's not what's going to happen. The Comanches begin looting the mission. A few miles away at the soldiers' fort, Padilla is notified by a local Amerind that the Comanches have arrived and they are now looting the mission a few miles away. So Padilla decides to send a mounted party of soldiers to go over and help them before he can gather all of his forces and head there himself. Now, as the Padres will learn in grisly detail, those mounted soldiers will never arrive. They're intercepted by a sort of rear guard force that the Comanches have. They are killed out on the field. They're scalped, and their scalps are brought back by their killers to the mission, where they're then waved around in public over the Comanches' heads, and this seems to spur the rest of the Comanches and Wichitas into action, and they set upon the priests. Other than one Padre named Molina, all of the Spanish priests will be killed. Now, the Comanches actually will never turn on the fort where these soldiers are garrisoned. Once they're done looting and killing the priests in the mission, they're going to head off and basically ignore the fort. It seems like their point has been made. Hämäläinen has a rather lengthy passage getting at the situation faced both on the ground and psychologically by the Spaniards and the Apaches. Because let's remember, both of these groups had goals for the San Saba mission. The Spaniards were there to ostensibly Christianize the Apaches, while the Apaches were hoping that the Spanish presence in the middle of Texas would maybe disrupt this Comanche southward sweep. But as Hämäläinen describes, both parties would be greatly disappointed. He says the following, quote, "If the loss of life was limited, the psychological aftermath was enormous. The attack was a military operation aimed at eliminating an enemy encroachment, but it was also a symbolic attack laden with political messages. The attackers openly declared their nationality, perhaps to stake territorial claims, or perhaps to proclaim that they were not afraid of Spanish reprisal, and their French weapons, by all accounts manifestly displayed, bespoke of far-reaching commercial and political connections. The violence itself, it seems, was staged for maximum impact. The attackers slaughtered oxen and other animals, destroyed church ornaments and sacred jewels and pictures, and overturned and beheaded the effigy of St. Francis. They left behind stripped, scalped, eyeless bodies, and placed the beheaded body of a friar on the church altar. If the intention was to use strategic violence to coerce the Spanish to cut off their support of the Apaches, it worked." End quote. Hämäläinen picks up on this point as it relates to the Apaches. He says the following, quote, "The destruction of the San Saba mission also left the Apaches demoralized, although none of their kin had died in the attack. Realizing that Spanish soldiers could not protect them on the plains, the Lipans began to retreat to the south and east." End quote. In response to this catastrophe, the Spanish are actually going to court for themselves another defeat. Basically, back in San Antonio, which serves as the headquarters for the Spaniards in Texas, the Spanish government is predictably upset, and they decide to send out a punitive expedition to, try and reassert themselves on the southern plains. And we've already seen one or two successful punitive expeditions launched out of New Mexico. But this Texas territory, well, it goes a little bit differently for the Spanish. They put Padilla in charge of 600 soldiers, including 134 Lipan Apaches, and many others were Amarins out of New Spain. So these would be Amarins that have had a lot of contact with the Spanish and might have served in military roles previously as well. And they even had a supply chain that was supposed to keep them in the field for a long time if need be. As Fehrenbach points out, Padilla had, at this point, under his command, more men than Cortez or Pizarro had during their respective campaigns in Mexico and Peru. So you'd think that Padilla is well positioned to deliver to the Comanches a striking blow. Padilla's campaign sets off in August of 1759, but before they ever actually see any Comanches, they'll run into a tribe of Tonkawas. Now, the Tonkawas are a smallish tribe out of mostly eastern Texas. They're reportedly excellent hunters, but they're also known to history for another reason. They're cannibals. And it should be noted that it's thought that almost all tribes in Texas practiced some form of cannibalism. But the Tonkawas don't do their cannibalism as ritualistically as other tribes do, and we will learn that in graphic detail later on in our story, but we'll set that aside for another time. So Padilla runs into some Tonkawas, he decides to attack, kills 55, and takes another 150 or so women and children into Spanish captivity. Now, the Spanish do come across the Comanches in October, way north in Texas along the Red River, or at least near the Red River. According to Padilla, he stumbled onto a camp of 6,000 Amarins. Now, that's almost certainly an overestimation to help save his reputation, but amongst the Comanches are some Wichitas. And even more interestingly, there are some Frenchmen there trading guns as well. Fehrenbach has a description of the engagement that soon unfolded here. He said the following, quote, "Padilla suffered the worst military catastrophe dealt to Spanish arms in Texas. When he attacked the masked Indians, his civilized Indian allies, those are the Amarins from New Spain rather than the Apaches, the civilized Indian allies ran for their lives instead of at the enemy, and his Lipan Apache allies disappeared. Padilla fought his way out of an Indian encirclement, with very small losses in the number of Spaniards, but he abandoned his 2 cannon and all his supplies, and a few weeks later reappeared at Bexar, that's San Antonio, after a precipitous retreat. Few Spaniards were killed, but Spanish power was dealt an enormous psychological defeat." End quote. Padilla would soon be court-martialed back to Mexico. His time in the plains ends in yet another defeat. Now, it'll certainly take some time, but eventually these Spaniards will figure out a way to if not bring the Comanches into the fold, at least hammer out some sort of tolerable peace with their new and dangerous enemies to the north. And they won't do it alone. Germs will be involved, smallpox specifically, and some changing dynamics on the frontier. So we will get into that more in our next episode on this series about the Comanches.